or rather Ukraine, with the involvement of Russia as an invasion force. And this is steering not just the metals markets. We've been seeing a whole range of commodities affected by this, many now fearing for potential concerns about how we feed the world later on this year. But let's stick on the metals markets and introduce our next guest today, John Mayer from SP Angel. John, welcome. We've spoken about this before, albeit briefly, but I know at the moment we talk as we see the EU starting to discuss the fifth round of sanctions against Russia. Explain more about what's happening in the markets and how the markets are reacting to the news.
Well, markets reacted upwards. I don't want to use the word positively to news of sanctions, to even the threat of sanctions, because Russia is quite a big metals exporter. The Ukraine is also an exporter of metals and some processed metals, particularly on the industrial side of things with iron ore, vanadium and titanium. Russia is very big in nickel. It's a moderate size in copper, for example. So those metals have been strong. Of course, nickel has had a titanic effect in the market, having risen to $101,000 a ton, and then with metals trades unwound or cancelled, and then the price collapsing and collapsing for the last 3 trading sessions, limit down each time, and each time they increase the limit, it crashes to that limit down stage. So there's a lot of nickel being sold, presumably being sold in order to cover collateral losses on margin calls and things like that. So who knows exactly what's going on in the nickel market right now, but the rest of the market is not following what's happening in nickel. If we look at copper, the price is still very strong. Zinc, aluminium is up at a new high again. Tin, those prices are still very firm where they are because of the disruption in the world right now.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're seeing evidence coming through from the auto sector, for example. We're seeing that many automakers are finding it difficult to manufacture vehicles because of spare parts. It's not just small parts, we're talking big parts, as you say. Steel is a bit of a problem, vanadium, tin, copper. And we know that it's not just automobile manufacture that's being hit. And ironically, of course, as the world wants to move into electric vehicles, I guess that too is being hit. I mean, a lot of concerns about how we're going to get a lot of parts for electric vehicles coming through as well. This seems to me to be with us a long while. We're going to be a long time in trying to overcome the problems that are already being hit because of COVID, because of the supply chain issues. Adding to this now with the invasion, it's going to cause all sorts of problems for years to come, isn't it?
Well, there are some basic vehicle parts that come out of the Ukraine. They're the sorts of parts where you can have those parts made elsewhere. There was a big focus in the press on wiring looms, which is making the wiring loom for a vehicle is very manual, labor-intensive process where you tend to farm that out to lower cost areas. But it is possible to shift that manufacturing around the world fairly fast, and it's affecting the Germans more than anyone else. But remember, we've also got COVID impacting cities in China, and that's more up in the northeastern province of Jilin, for example, and hitting their steel production. But it's always possible that might spread into other parts of China. And if you think back to the first few months of 2020, when the COVID outbreak, it was in Wuhan and started hitting the news, the first problems we had were with diodes, which were only made in China. So sanctions against China would be much more serious to global manufacturing than sanctions against Russia, because we don't really have such a lot of trade with Russia. It's Ukraine, I think, was more of an issue, and certainly will be from a food stock and fertilizer perspective. But Russia isn't such a big deal because the West had been, the West was more careful about dealing with Russia anyway over a longer term period.
It just highlights, doesn't it, the problems that the world has with the delivery of certain metals. I was talking just last week to the chief executive of Altona Rare Earths and their rare earth exploration going on in Africa, and they were saying that he's talking to so many people in the West that are desperate for their own stockpiles. I mean, China has been such a massive stockpiler of not just rare earths, but other metals as well. Ownership of metals production is based in China, around Africa. A lot of Chinese money, of course, going in there. How in the West, how are we going to wean ourselves off all this commodity coming from the East?
Well, I think weaning ourselves off commodities from Russia is relatively simple, although the palladium issue is a bit more difficult. But platinum can be substituted for palladium, and that comes more out of South Africa than Russia, and that will just take a bit of time. When it comes to China, so much of the world's mineral processing, this is smelting and refining, is now done in China, and they've built that up really over the last 10 to 15 years. That it would be very difficult for the world to impose strict sanctions on China, and the Chinese wouldn't want that either, frankly. So we are very, very connected, and more connected with China, that's for sure. And we now see India is also trading and buying discounted oil from Russia. So it may be that India is subject to sanctions going forwards, which again would cause further issues. But China is certainly the biggest worry here. But if anything, I think the situation that we're in is more than likely to cause China to increase local stimulus, rev up a bit more on what it's doing with its infrastructure, its Belt and Road logistics. I mean, a large part of its Belt and Road system was going through the Ukraine. So they're going to have to find another way round Ukraine. And I think the Chinese are not overly happy with Russia for creating the trouble in the world that's happening right now, because it's not coming at a good time for China. They have a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that are big employers from a jobs perspective that are very, very sensitive to inflation. And China has been working really hard to keep raw material and other inflation down for these small and medium-sized enterprises. And China's just blown that up, so to speak.
One final area you haven't spoken about, and that is, as you say, actually, in terms of weaning ourselves off Russian commodities, maybe slightly easier. We're talking about fuel, energy. I know that, as you say, that a lot of the German manufacture is done using gas that comes in from Russia. As Western nations, I know here in the UK, the discussion's now heating up around the idea that we should adopt this idea of small nuclear reactors in the UK at a regional level. So I guess the new metal, or next metal to watch out for, is going to be uranium, amongst other things, as we see ramping up of nuclear fuel processes again.
You're right there. I mean, the Germans were looking at closing a number of reactors, and they're not going to do that now. And I think Japan will probably be restarting some sooner rather than later. Everybody realizes the price of gas is so high now that you want to move off gas just as fast as you can. And this is a huge wake-up call for the global economy, that you can't rely on a single source of energy in the way that Europe has been relying on Russian gas. And to many of us, this has been obvious for many years, but it just didn't seem to be obvious to French, German, and other politicians.
And it's ironic, of course, as France is probably one of the most advanced nuclear nations within Europe. How do you see the future developing then for this area of the market? As I said, uranium is an interesting metal. What else goes alongside in terms of metals demand that would be needed for nuclear reactors?
Well, building nuclear reactors is a very long process. There are specialist metals that are required. Those metals have to be unbelievably tough and very well made. Yes, there'll be vanadium, titanium, nickel used in those metals, rare earths, no doubt, in some areas. I've actually been to certain sites in the world where they make the nose cones for rockets and the chambers for these nuclear reactors in some very clever metallurgical ways. But they're not huge tonnages. But certainly the big thing for the West is more the electrification. It's going to be the wind farms and the solar farms. Those things are going to move faster than they were before. There'll be more money than ever than we've seen for those installations, particularly offshore wind. But let's not forget the solar. The solar panels use a lot of silver their connections, because you need to have good, reliable connections for the electricity to come off the solar panels and into the cables, copper cables, and they tend to be big cables, big heavy cables for the wind farms, and the rare earths, the neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium for the generators for those wind farms. So there will be a lot more metal, not just the steel, but everything else in use here.
Yeah. Okay. Look, John, thanks so much indeed for updating us as we look into another week of the unknowns around what's happening in Russia, but at the same time, trying to find a way for the West to wean ourselves off the commodities that we've been so relying on Russia and Ukraine for. That's John Mayer from SP Angel. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.